She is here. Good. She would love to talk to you. Good morning, everyone. Do you have any questions or comments about anything you've ever wondered ever? I'm kidding. You can ask. I don't know. I don't know everything. Genesis, though? Anything like Genesis so far? Anybody? Any questions or comments about Genesis so far? Yes, ma'am. Good. Did I hear you? Where did ancient people think God resided? And is it different in the two creation stories? That is a great question. We have evidence. Well, ancient people in general believed that the gods lived in different places, but they all agree that the gods lived up high, either high on top of a mountain. And most people believe gods lived on top of mountains, and that's why mountains were associated with the gods. Israelites are no different. So Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai of course, Moses meets God there. An ancient person will go, yeah, that's his mountain. Okay. We're not shocked that he goes up high and then he meets Yahweh. So they believe the God in the mountains. The other place they put the gods are in sacred spaces, and those sacred spaces can be mountains. They can be sometimes associated with shrubs or trees, like when Abraham in Genesis 12, he meets God at the oak of Mamre. So oftentimes temples were constructed at places they thought the gods already lived. And typically the temples were built up pretty high, just like the ancient Greek city-states. That they were usually the highest part of the town. It was closest to where the gods resided. And so they might build the sacred space of temples, so God lived in temples. And then ultimately, they might say, ultimately, the gods also lived up there in the heavens, the highest level, so way, way up high, what we would call the upper realm of the atmosphere, up in the skies. And so that was very common. It was always up high. Those are the main areas. So way up there. The Jews develop different strands. We have different views of what the Jews believed. Sorry, we have evidences of various views the Jews held. God could be in sacred spaces. Temples, for sure. He had to construct those sacred spaces for the temple, and you had to act appropriately. God could live on mountains. And the other thing is they tend to believe seems to have been the dominant view eventually, that God liked to hang out at the temple, but ultimately his real residing space is outside. And so I had a picture for a long time, like a temple, a cosmic temple way outside of the earth, that he was up past that third heaven. We would say, and this is, we don't see that's the problem. If you think of it in layers, we might say almost above the atmosphere, but they don't have that concept. The point is you can't see it totally, but it is there. And they had, I think I said this way back in Genesis 1 particularly, because Arakim, which is probably translated firmament, hard shell, they often believe that firmament itself was light blue to clear. And so we have examples like in Ezekiel where he describes the throne room of God. Is it Ezekiel 37 or Ezekiel 1? And he talks about the bottom of God's throne room being the same color, transparent and clear, light blue, that it was right up super high. So they seem to have a real spatio-temporal location, a geography located where they thought God lived or dwelt. But the way that God made his way amongst humans was sacred space on earth like temples. But his real dwelling place, it's kind of like, how I see it, that God's temple is his winter home. It's his condo. It's not his real home, but that's the truth. So it's not like God was homeless until they built a tabernacle or temple. Not at all. Well, I don't know where to live. I don't know where to live. But it says, all right, I'll make my way amongst you. I will bless you with my presence when a sacred space, but you have to build it just like this. You have to behave a certain way and do these things. And that develops the entire system of what we call the priestly class. The priest's whole function was to keep the sacred space sacred for God's presence. And the second it wasn't sacred, he's out. He would not evict them, he just abandoned them. And so they took that very, very, that's the whole purpose of Leviticus. You've got to get sacred space straight. This morning you asked, but that's exactly what they thought. The prophets had a different view. The prophets in general said, no, if you want sacred space, you have to be ethical. God wants to ride with you if you act right, not give proper sacred space sacrifices. And by the time Jesus comes around, Jesus sides with the prophets. Second question was, are they different in the creation accounts? We don't know. And it seemed to me that Genesis 2 doesn't tell us enough. Genesis 1 does seem to be the case that God's sacred space is beyond creation. He's outside of the the formless waters. We don't have indication that he lives in the formless waters, but they're there, and he's outside of it, it seems like, because he's the one dividing it. So I think the picture I showed, that basically like an air bubble, I think is the best way to think whoever wrote Genesis 1 thought of it that way. Genesis 2, we don't have any indication that God's just all of a sudden he's on the earth doing things sometimes, like fashioning Adam, man, out of Adamah, the earth. And then, of course, he breathes in him. And then later on, he's kind of wandering through the garden. Hey, where'd you go? And a little bit when they sin. So there it's, but again, like I said before, that particular tradition of the people who wrote those texts, they always pictured God as close. We would say the word imminent. But the people who wrote the priest thought seem as transcendent. They have those two things are in tension constantly throughout the Old Testament. On the one hand, is way out there. You have Isaiah, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Where can you build a house contain me? And so they'll slam the role of the temple. Like, don't think for 1 second, you've got me. It's my winter home. I don't live here. I bless your presence by it, but I can leave whenever I want. And I'll stop there. I'll go on for a long bit. Good. What are your thoughts on that? Any questions, comments? Oh, yeah. So that's why in John's theology, fast forward a few centuries in John's gospel, John's theology, unlike the other synoptic, well, it's similar, but it's not. John really makes this evident and clear. And John, he says explicitly in John 1 in his prologue, John says that the Word became flesh, and the Greek word actually is skoneo. It's the word for dwelt, but it's the Greek word they use for the Old Testament for tabernacled. And so if you were literal, you might say the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And that fits Johannine theology very much. So John's focus, he wants his readers to hear that Jesus is a walking temple. He's the walking presence of God Almighty in the flesh. And that's why he'll say things like, I am, before Abraham was, I am, and so forth. That's implied in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but John really makes it, he's like, do not miss this. He's a walking sacred space. And Jews do not comprehend that. That wouldn't make any sense to them. That's why Paul says it's a stumbling block to them. It doesn't make any sense for them. In a temple, sure. In a person, nope. Nope. Good. Anything else? You want to wrap up on that? Amen. Anything else? Welcome back, world travelers. Traveler. She was here too earlier. You left your wife there. Anything else on Genesis? Very good question. Anything else? Glad you're here on Genesis chapter 2. And we stopped last time. We're in Genesis chapter 2 around verses 8 to 14-ish. So just remind yourself, or 8 to 14, I'll go back again. And Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he set the human whom he had fashioned there. And Yahweh God caused every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for eating to grow from the ground, and the tree of the life within the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and bad, or good and evil. And a river was going out from Eden to water the garden, and it was dispersed from there and became 4 heads. And then he lists the 4 different heads, and the 4th river, that is Euphrates. And so we talked about Eden, the garden. I have the picture on the screen here of the garden being more botanical gardens, because that's the point. We should not picture a rose garden, some European rose garden or American, whatever, but rather something that has all kinds of fruit trees and maybe even animals, exotic trees and plants. We know this from the ancient world, that these kind of gardens were right beside oftentimes palaces. So it's a very kingly thing to do. This is very normal for the ancient person. He's describing what a normal monarch would have done. You build your palace, you have your really, really, really expensive, fancy garden. And so there we go. This Garden of Eden is literally, Eden means to enrich, to make abundant. And so it probably means something like waters. So the point is, this garden near a palace, and this Eden is the residence of God. So God lives here. It's a sacred space. And from it flows these waters. And you can put a lot of energy on the geography, but I said last week, and many scholars don't, and I don't think you should put a lot of energy on where to find it. The point is that God's presence, He causes all the life to come. And so if you're in the ancient world, water is life, and like it is today, right? But we can usually get it if we funnel it and so forth. But in the ancient world, you got to live near it. And so the idea is that God's presence, and He sends forth life to all vegetation, which allows the earth to have it. So it's more like that. The point is fertility. It emanates from God's presence. Later on, Ezekiel will have a image that God lives like in a garden in Eden, and he gives life. And Revelation is a similar thing. So the point is, it seems to me that's the point, not, okay, which geographical location? The point is, God is the source of all life. And so he puts this human being there, this human being. Now in Genesis 2, he's not in the image of God. We might imply that. But here, this particular human is made to do a particular thing, and that is to be in that garden. Now, I want to talk more about that in a second, exactly what he's going to do, why he's there. What is this tree of life and the tree of knowledge and evil, or knowledge and good? Okay, the tree of life is well known in the ancient world. They show up in many other cosmogonies, so origin stories. Tree of life shows up a lot. The tree of knowledge and good and evil shows up nowhere else. So it's a very Jewish biblical concept. And so we'll talk about those in seriatim in order. So the tree of life, we almost certainly should see that as granting, extending life, like perpetual life. And so sometimes you see things, they might say it grants immortality, maybe, probably not. The point is, the Hebrew word means something like there's no anticipated ending. No anticipated ending. So the point is, fruit constantly counteracts aging. We have I think it came from the Spaniard tradition. I don't remember exactly, but the old fantasy of the fountain of, right, the fountain of youth. It doesn't make you immortal. You don't drink, go, now I'll never die. That is, as long as I keep drinking this, then I will never die. I have to keep going back to the fountain, as it were, ideally. So that's how it is with this tree. So that means, it implies, it does mean this, and this is, so many things in this text have been, as many scholars, not all, but find pretty much disagree with common church teaching and preaching because they don't know, they haven't studied it carefully. God designed Adam to die. The only way he can keep living is if he keeps having access to the tree of life, which he does. He's not prohibited to eat from that. So the author of Genesis 2 is making the argument, originally, humans were designed to keep living for on and on in the presence of God. They had access, God graded a way for them to keep enjoying his presence forever. Now we'll see in a little bit, he's about to block access to that, so then they will do what they were designed to do, which is die. So it's not because they were born immortal. God gave them access to keep eating from the trees that he supplied the water for, the nutrients, the presence. But that's not what happens. In fact, they're going to see in a second, they lose access to it. But that's what it means. So the point is, people were designed that way, which means from the very beginning, there was death. For example, you might, this is, and we can talk about this now or later if you want to, but later on we'll talk about Romans 5 when Paul talks about Adam being brought into Adam brought sin into the world and therefore brought death. But in the Genesis account, we have no indication that things weren't dying already. We have no, for example, if this first man really did have skin on him, epidermis, are they live skin cells or? The answer is they are dead skin cells. That epidermis is chiefly dead skin, so they died. These skin cells died. Gnats, if there were any kind of animals whatsoever, we have no evidence they didn't have predation that is killing other animals. We don't have any of it. If a fruit fell off a tree, an apple, if there were, let's say there's a banana, I don't know if they're ancient banana, and it died, well, the banana died because it was alive, and then it died. Or if a leaf fell off and shriveled up, it died. So death was there. The point is, it was always in the text, but the humans, Adam, were not designed to die. They had access to the tree of life too. And that's what's about to happen in a little bit. But so they had access, it was a good deal. Yes?
So there are two separate trees?
Two separate trees. There's many trees, but there's two particular authors talking about. That's right. That's right. That's right, two different trees. Now, the second tree, sometimes people hear say the tree of knowledge. No, it's not the tree of knowledge. It's not the tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge of good and evil or good and bad. That's a merism. If you don't know in grammar, a merism is where you say two things to make the same point. So good and bad, it implies the same thing. So here, what does it mean to be the tree of knowledge of good and bad? Well, this is where I find Walton to be very helpful because he looks up every single time, as usual, how these expressions are used. So in the Bible, good and bad, good and evil put together shows up many times in the Bible. So, for example, when good and bad is used with the verb to speak good and bad, or good and evil, it suggests the speaker passes judgment on or makes a decision. It makes a decision. So to speak good and bad is to discern some decision and judge, make a judgment, make a decision, discern something, to speak good and bad. Two, when good and bad is used with the verb not to speak, but to hear good and bad, it means to listen with discernment to the details of a case or judge the legitimacy of a claim. You seeing a pattern so far? Maybe not. Third, when it's used with the verb to know and some other grammatical stuff, it refers to the human capacity to be discriminating. And this is why this is lacking in children. Besides passages to two passages in Genesis 2 to 3, well, I'm going to skip that. Yeah, so children don't have knowledge of good and bad. The other thing is, this is characteristic of God in chapter 3, verse 22. God, you'll be like God. God knows the difference between good and evil, good and bad. So the common denominator of all these references, depending on the verb, is discerning or discriminating wisdom, to know how to discern what decision to make in those decisions. So knowing good and evil is a characteristic of God, but not of children. And I gave you quote Deuteronomy 1, Isaiah 7. It's also not it's not a quality of certain elderly. That's very true, all you old people. My goodness. I'm kidding. It says that in 2 Samuel 19:35. They might not have the knowledge of good and evil. Or the inexperienced, 1 Kings 3:9. It's something people are inclined to desire and can use to gain, like Genesis 3:6. So even though Adam and Eve lack this knowledge of wisdom, how to make wise decisions, they could still be held responsible for obedience. And when people gain the knowledge of eating the fruit, they can be legitimately described as being like God. And so probably what's going on is when an ancient person read it and heard it, they're thinking that Adam and Eve were seeking wisdom or how to discriminate right choices in life. God has that wisdom. This tree has it independent of God. Therein lies the sin. So do not, which becomes a major strand of Jewish theology, which is the whole book of Proverbs, chiefly Song of Solomon, which is do not seek wisdom apart from God. They'd probably say ultimately there is none. To do that, to seek it independently, is to seek independence, which means you don't want to be in the presence of God, you don't want to do it His way. And so that's almost certainly what's going on. That's how we are like God when we seek things apart from Him. When we try to discriminate, make moral choices on our own, basically, he says it's like what humans do. And I do think that in general, I might have said this, but I think Adam and Eve, we need to keep thinking, probably so, that Adam and Eve represent humans. That is to say, they're paradigmatic. They're an archetype. Just so the point is, if that's true, then it's like saying the ancient Jewish boy, Daddy, why do humans do these things? Right now I talked about an etiology, an answer to the question of how come or why. Daddy, did humans, are we designed to die? And the answer would be, well, yes and no. Yes, we come from dust, and dust we will return. Yep, that's true. But we were not supposed to stay this way. Originally, God designed us to be mortal. We've always been designed to be mortal, but He didn't want us to die because He wanted to stay in His presence forever. Well, what happened? Well, a long time ago, or really like all humans all the time, we always have this choice. And there was a time when we had access to live in His presence all the time. The problem is, to do that means you have to always be obedient to what He says. Every word He says, you have to obey what God says. And the original humans didn't do that at all. Instead, they sought to try to live like God and try to gain wisdom and make their own choices in life apart from Him. That's not good, is it, Daddy? No, it's not. What happened? Well, they were punished. But why did they make that choice? Well, it was their fault, but not totally their fault. They were tempted. They were tempted? Yeah. Something outside them tempted them. And so, son, whenever you get tempted, you're not supposed to listen to those temptations of life, because you too can make a wise choice by being obedient to God and seek your wisdom from Him. I'm kind of getting ahead, but that's why I want to summarize at the very end of the whole thing. But this is these stories of. So let me pause here for a second. So that probably is what's going on. Any questions or comments about that? Verse 15. Oh, yes. So close. I'm kidding.
If Eve had never eaten
Correct. The fruit is not apple. That comes from a lot. Yeah. The fruit.
what would, what would happen? How would our world be?
Good. So if Eve had never eaten that fruit, how would our world be different? Yeah, well, of course, the text doesn't tell us. The assumption would be based on that theology that then we would never well then that would not have been the original sin, the first sin. But we don't have evidence that humans would never have sinned. It just means they wouldn't have sinned there. So if they never sinned ever, 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 well, then we never have sinned. We will live as the way God designed us to live, which is in His presence, being obedient to what He wants us to do, but always being perfectly faithful and loyal to Him alone. And that is exactly what we're designed to do. And that Jewish theology never goes away, Old or New Testament. That's why Paul can say in Ephesians, you were created new in Christ for good works. We were designed to do. That's why Jesus can say in several Gospels, certainly John's Gospel, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. The whole point is to be loyal to Him and faithful. So that, in that sense, we would always do that just right, which means He would need to die on the cross for us and ever. We'd be just like my wife, just heavenly.
I just wondered.
Good.
Because, I mean, you can't say through the generations that no one would sin, but no one would have the original sin of the fruit of the garden. Would we still be living in the garden?
Would we still be living in the garden? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So those speculations, I'm not always afraid. I'm not afraid to. I don't know about that. I'm not. My own view, as I've said a little bit, my own view is that I don't think we should be thinking of a geographical location. That if you took a bus trip, that you'd find this Eden place. Now, an ancient auditor, an ancient hearer who heard this story, they might have thought that. They might have thought, because as he says in the East, they might have thought, if I can just go far enough, I'm going to find a spot. That is certainly possible. Absolutely, that's possible. I just don't think that's the point. I think
It was evil
evil that, okay, we're going to talk about that later. You said the evil that tempted us. I won't say that. No, evil did not tempt us. I'm persuaded by that. There's no mention of evil in Genesis 3. Besides knowledge of good and evil. And that's why I like the translation good and bad, because evil starts importing Satan and the devil, and that's not what's going on here at all. Go ahead.
if you're going to get into it, I'll bring it.
No, that's good. Good stuff. Yes, I will. Yeah, so yes. Please ask away if I don't answer that question later on. Good. Anybody else? Move ahead. Yeah.
I was just thinking where it says in Deuteronomy, God has set before us blessings in life and cursings in death.
Yes.
And that's kind of like these trees, life and death. It's almost like that.
You see it like in Deuteronomy where it says God has set before you blessings and then life and then death. I absolutely concur with you. Can you believe that? High five. Red, first time. I absolutely concur with you. I think in Deuteronomy, the person of Deuteronomy is making the same point, which is you have before you consequences of. Now, I'm importing the term there, I think, based on, I'm saving a lot of time because this is not a undergrad master level course, but I'm convinced that the author wrote those things, is also thinking of wisdom. See, wisdom is a way to order life the way God wants it. The way to order life the way God wants it. I use the word designed. That's my word, but it's not a Hebrew word, nor is the word wisdom always used. Or order, but that is the point. That's right. So if you live the way life ordered for you, you will live life. That's exactly right. And I think that's in the background of text just like this. They're just writing in a different genre, which is more like a mytho-history. It's more of a, yep, this is true of all of us. They have done what we do. Yeah.
You kind of have to look at Genesis like an ancient person is looking at it. We can't look at it like
Look at like an ancient person. I absolutely, yes, think that we should always. I do not care. I fundamentally do not care how a modern person wants to read it. I cannot, if I could ooze that from my pores. I don't care if an American reads it. I don't care if a Protestant reads it, or a Catholic reads it, or a white person reads it. I want to read like an ancient person. It was not written to me, or a white person, or a Catholic, or a Protestant. It was written to Jews 3 centuries ago, probably. And so all that to say, I want to hear how they understood it. That's right. And then we start making therefore application. But first, I want to hear what they had to say. That way, the text stays authoritative. I'm not the authority; the text is. So, I'll go ahead. Verse 15. No, ma'am. Yes. So, even if you took a literal interpretation, Eden was still destroyed because of the flood. The rivers will be in the same places. You're not going to find it based on geography. Yeah, maybe. I just, the text doesn't say that. It's so hard for me to, when I see different traditions represented in the text, I keep thinking it's hard for me to fill in those gaps. Because to that I might say, wait, if Eden represents the presence of God, how did God get killed in the flood? And anywhere God is in sacred space, why would Eden get hurt by that? And da da da. But see, the people who wrote the flood narratives, and there's two different stories later on in Genesis, neither one of them mention Eden. So Eden's never mentioned again. It's never, which another reason why I don't think they should be treating it as a geographical location that one day this one Jew, he found it again. It's never, ever. So maybe, maybe so.
Eden means abundance, right?
Eden means abundance, yes.
Why can't we just say the Garden of Abundance, which could be the entire planet?
You could say the Garden of Abundance could be the whole planet because they don't treat it like it's the whole planet. That's why. They treat it like it's, he says, in the east, and from it is the heads of 4 different rivers. So I think they would have thought it's way, way on the east side of the edge of the world. Yeah, no, it's good. I just don't, yeah, it's good. Maybe. Verse 15. Good, good. And Yahweh God took the human, earlier he formed, right? And he put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to watch over it. Those two Greek, the Hebrew words, to work it and watch it. Watch over it. So here now we finally get into the place where we find out what this author is saying is the function of Adam. The function, and here it is. So here then is a succinct statement of the problem when we try to decide whether work it is over the agricultural task or we called sacred service. Remember I said the garden is like in God's sacred space. If the object of the verb is the garden, and we can't be sure that it is, to work it mean the garden, we have a bit of an anomaly because the verb usually takes dirt, soil, ground objects when it refers to agricultural work. It usually takes personal objects like God or Baal or Egypt when sacred service or servitude is the point. And I could go on for a long time there. But the broadest point is that when you took the words work and serve, depending on the direct object, depends on whether it's a thing they're working like the soil or they're working their sacred space to serve the gods. So in that sense, the second sense, to work the sacred space to serve the gods, it is a priestly function. It's the way to describe what priests might do in a sacred space like the tabernacle or the sanctuary or the temple. I can give you references if you want. Exodus 3:12, Numbers 3:7-10. There, the object of the verb usually refers to what or whom is being worshipped. So it is likely that the tasks given to Adam are of a priestly nature. He's caring for sacred space. It's not because, boy, them tree of life trees get out of hand. You got to cut them back. You got to prune them. And I need a worker to make sure my landscaping looks pretty. That is probably not at all what's going on. But rather, because Eden represents God's sacred space, more like a temple mount, sanctuary, or whatever, and he has his very beautiful arboretum gardens right beside it that he is fueling. I need someone to make sure that my sacred space is taken care of. And if that's true, then that's exactly what Adam's role is. It's like a priest. It's like, that is to say, he's tending to sacred space. He's making sure it stays pure and clean and good and right and doing whatever God tells him to do. Now, take care of my space. Just do not eat from the thing where you try to seek wisdom apart from me. And I find that very persuasive. I think it's exactly what I think his role is. And he says in verse 16, Yahweh God commanded the human, saying, you may eat from every tree of the garden, but from the tree of knowledge of good and bad you shall not eat from it, because in the day you eat it from it, you'll die. Okay, now let me explain that a little bit. The expression in the day or in that day is one of the major ways in Hebrew to say when. When. And does not suggest that the events described will take place in the next 24 hours, though oftentimes it implies promptness. So to say it that way, in the day you eat it, because in the day you eat it, when you eat it, that is to say, it's not in the day. The point is not instantaneously, but you are susceptible to it. Now you are open to it happening. Same thing. In Jeremiah 26:8, the exact same phrase is used. But in Jeremiah 26:11, it shows exactly what the people mean by using the phrase. They say this in Jeremiah, you will surely die. They're talking about the eventual outcome of behavior. And you can look up Jeremiah 26:11. So the sentence will be passed, the doom will be fixed. So if you paraphrase Genesis 2:17 properly, it is this: when you eat of it, you will be sentenced to death and therefore doomed to die. That is, death will be a certainty. I'll do that one more time. When you eat of it, you will be sentenced to death and therefore doomed to die. So he does not, that's based on Hebrew. I'm not importing anything else, just the Hebrew. It is not about, so people say, well, that God was confused because they didn't die. Once they ate the apple, they didn't go, Well, people do say apples, not an apple. When they eat the fruit, they eat, here, want some of this fruit, and they just fall dead. That's not what happened, but that's not what he said would happen. You'll be sentenced to death. That's going to happen.
So they're mortal.
They are mortal. They are mortal. That's exactly right. From that second on, well, you're always mortal. Now you've lost access to that tree of life. That's exactly right. And in that sense, they do and they will die. Certainly, they will physically die. And this is why I'm persuaded, and not all scholars are, but many scholars are, but in church life, everybody says this opposite, which is, well, they didn't die, they died. No, that's not what normal people say. They say they had what kind of death? Not a physical death, but a spiritual death. That is absolutely wrong. Hebrews have no concept of a spiritual death. There's nowhere present in the Old Testament. There's no concept of your spirit dying. There's no concept of a spirit. We say, no, David, what that means is the relationship with God is severed. Okay, that's fine. That's not in the Old Testament. You might say in the New Testament the idea is there, but not in the Old Testament. And I want to hear what they had to say. There's no concept. When they used the word death, they meant die. They meant physically die. The reason why people, again, tend to bring up its spiritual death is based, one more time, on the belief that God must have been mistaken. We can't be mistaken. They didn't die as soon as they ate their fruit. Oh, he wasn't talking about physical death. He's talking about spiritual death. I'm saying that's not persuasive. He didn't mean they will die on the spot. It means they have a death sentence. You've now lost access to the tree of life. It's over. So they do, in fact, die, henceforth, as we still do. I'm convinced of it. So what are your thoughts on that? Any questions, comments? Well, David, isn't it true, while you're thinking for a second, isn't it true that it did have a kind of spiritual death, the relationship with God severed? Yeah, okay. It's not what the text says, but okay. I mean, that's all right, yeah. I just want to hear that's all I'm saying about that. I mean, anything? Yeah, you should not live by bread alone, but every word. See, yeah, that's right. So yeah, and Jesus says in John 4, right? He says, "And my food is to do the will of the Father who sent me." And okay, yeah. So they do, in fact, they will. They have been sentenced to death. Now, not yet. He says, if you do that. So still, they're cool. They're great. They haven't happened yet. I'm going to get ahead of myself. Verse 18, unless there's something else. Yahweh God said, it's not good for the human to be by himself. By himself. You might say alone, by himself. I'll make for him, now this is, in the Hebrew, is helper, partner, and you can translate it strength. I'll make him a strength. It's used that way in different Hebrew texts. But to get the point across is probably helper / partner / counterpart, corresponding to him. another half, you might say. Verse 19, and Yahweh God fashioned from the ground every animal of the field and every bird of the skies and brought it to the human to see what he would call it. Let me pause there. Notice that is absolutely different from Genesis 1. In Genesis 1 is at day 4, day 5, he says, and the land produced all the animals. He said, let the land bring forth all the animals. So again, this is a different understanding of where animals come from. So here he makes they're all animals and the birds, and he brings them to the human to say, what are you going to call these things? And because naming is a way of demonstrating authority over it in the ancient world all the time. All the time. It still is. When we got new dolls, we would say, what's her name? I wouldn't name her. I mean, I could. No. Right? We always assume it's your doll, and you get to name her. And for a long time, it was Diamond, every doll. Sparkle. And, I'll have long stories about that. So you get to name these animals because you're in charge of them. And whatever the human would call it, each living being, that would be its name. Just to demonstrate authority over all the animals. Verse 20, and the human gave names to every domestic animal and bird of the skies and every animal of the field. Which you're an ancient Hebrew person, that's not trillions. That's just not many. It's the animals they know. But he did not find for the human a helper or strength or partner corresponding to him. For example, and this is really important here, because in the ancient world, there's a very similar story, but different in the Gilgamesh epic, the Babylonian epic, Gilgamesh. Well, in Enkidu, the main man, he's a half man, half beast. Like Red. He's a half beast. Neanderthal. He's half man, half beast, Enkidu is. And he's content with animal companionship. He's hanging out with a companion because he's half beast. Until he meets a woman, she's actually a prostitute, and she seduces him. As all women, I'm sorry, okay. And then he gives in and goes, okay, now I'm going to stay with women. Well, in the Genesis story, it's like that too, in that Adam's going to decide in a second, what he just did is, I'm not an animal then. None of these animals that have come up to me are like me. So the difference, of course, is, and he also is attracted to wife, but he's not half beast. He never hangs out and he never says, oh, we're all alike, I'm half like. No, he says, none of these beings are like me. None of them are. And I still think that's quite true. Okay. The other thing is, what does it mean to be a helper? We often think the words helper, we think of the word servant or slave or someone who comes and, again, does our lawn or something. And so they help us. And depending on your context, your cultural context, it might imply subservient or inferior. And someone's a helper, someone's a waiter, waitress, and that's all they are, like we're royalty. That's not at all what the Hebrew term means. In fact, oftentimes in the Old Testament, it is God who is called the exact same Hebrew word, helper. God's not inferior to you or me. He's not a servant or slave. He's called the helper. But I'll give you other examples. In Isaiah 41, people helping their neighbors or relatives could be helpers. People helping a political alliance or a coalition, Ezra 10:15. Military reinforcements could be helpers, Joshua 10:4, 2 Samuel 8:5. So nothing in the term suggests subservience of the one helping. In fact, typically the opposite is more likely. That's why that word can be translated strength. They come along to buttress, to help, like God or a backup army. So certainly helper cannot mean the complement of a leader. He just needed someone to do his dirty work. Absolutely mistaken. That might work in your marriage, but not in Adam and Eve. Amen, Brandon? Amen. That was a softball. I mean, I would just literally, if you were listening, you would have. So that's all that means. So someone that comes alongside to do what? Why would Adam need another strength or counterpart to help him? Because he is doing what? And this understanding, what? Well, not yet. He's not starting a human family yet. So far, God gave him a job. What is it? Take care, not worshiping God. Taking care of the sacred space. So you need to work it and cultivate this garden, my sacred space. You need to take care of it. Your job is to be like a priest. Make sure this sacred space stays a sacred space. Doesn't tell us what it means, but you work it until it makes sure it stays exactly the way I want it to stay. And he says, but it's not good that you're doing this by yourself. You can't do the task by yourself. I'll bring a bunch of animals to you and see if you like any of them. Nope, 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 nope.
This is kind of stupid, but
We like stupid questions here.
well, if he was just formed,
Yes.
how did he know how to name cow and a horse and a bird? Where did this come from?
Where did it come from? How did he know how to name cows and horses and stuff?
Because he had no schooling,
Yeah, no schooling.
and no.
Yes, yeah, the best teacher. This is evidence that he had red hair. Any other questions?
Just knew.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a good question. Yeah, so that is a,
Wondered that.
yeah, it's a good example.
And I thought, where did he get
Where to get it? That's right. Well, and if you get real,
That's okay.
no, it's good. I'm always trying to answer them in such a way that y'all don't leave the church. You go, he doesn't believe in the Bible. Yes, I do. Based on the genre, I don't. If we got, I don't like the word literal. I never use it. But if we were at face value, we thought this was an historical record of a thing that happened, it has an enormous amount of problems and questions. There's a lot of questions it does not answer that, for me, are quite profoundly contradictory if you tried to put them all in the same solutions together. You have to pick one or the other. For example, we're going to see in a second, when he creates Adam and he says he puts him in the garden, it doesn't say he's the only one he creates. And a little bit, when they get kicked out, they find cities. Cain and Abel marry other people. So you go, well, who did he? And then that's the typical fundamentalist says, well, he obviously married a sister. Obviously. Well, maybe. The problem with that is Jews thought that was an abomination. The text doesn't abhor it and it doesn't praise it. It's just very unlikely a Jew would go, of course, yeah, you're right. They married their siblings, and there's whole towns where they come from. So it doesn't answer. Another thing is, if he names them, what language did he use? Hebrew didn't exist. His name isn't Adam. That's a Hebrew word, Adam. Now you say, well, no, it did, and then we lost track of it forever until about the year 1500 BC. Maybe. But no one thinks that in scholar. I mean, the point is it didn't exist. It comes from later on Phoenicians and ancient Semitic languages. So his name wasn't Adam, and the animal names wouldn't have been in Hebrew. What language did he use? Did God teach him a language? Did he think it? Did he go, blur, blur? Did they get names? So my own, see, these are great. That's why there's a lot of problems, the question, which I will say, if that's the question, and it's fair to ask any question of the text, my response is then I don't know. But since I don't read it that way, but read it more as a genre of a cosmogony of answering these bigger questions, that's why I think it answers different questions. For example, I think it's asking the question, two things. Is there any other being, what they would say, living being? If an ancient Jew said, Daddy, is there any other living being just like humans? And philosophy would say that is ontologically equal, the same identity, the same kind of thing, rather, not the same identity. I think they would say, no, no. Adam looked at all the animals and realized none of them were just like him. None of them. And the other question is, okay, well, Daddy, does Adam, are humans in charge of everybody? No. Animals, yes. We name them. We have authority over them. But we'll see in a second, Adam does not name Eve. That's important. He names animals, but not Eve. And so, to me, that's the point. So it's a good question to ask. It's just that I think they're not answering those questions. But rather, God said, it's not good. You can't do this job alone. And no giraffe, cow, aardvark is going to help you till this sacred space. Yeah, you bring all these things, and he has authority over them. Yeah, I'll name. Yeah, but I'm not going to name any of these things human. And God says, all right, so here's what's going to happen. Good question. I'll move on. Anything else? We've got a few minutes. Maybe I should stop there. Any other question or comments about that? Yes, ma'am.
Comment about the naming of the animals.
Okay, naming of the animals.
They had to be named so that they would be separate from man, but they also had to be named to be separate from each species. If they weren't named, they would be considered as one.
Yes, you're saying the animals had to be named so they're separate or distinct from humans, but also distinct from each other, different species. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, I don't think they have any concept of species. The Hebrew word simply means kind, but they don't tell us, they don't have a Latin term genus and genus and the different, gets real technical later on. in biology, but this, we don't have evidence ancient Hebrews thought that way. They weren't dummies. I mean, I understand a bird's not a cow. They divided it, as we saw earlier too. Same thing in Genesis 1. They divided it by typically the role of the animal. So two things. One is where the animal lived, like birds lived in the sky. Then there's land animals and sea animals. They divided by the space, the three major areas. So land animal, so forth. Or the second way they distinguish whether or not they're domesticated or they're wild. Whether you eat them, you raise them, but that's it. Beyond that, they didn't break down to phalia and different. They just didn't. At least if they did, we have no evidence of it at all. The fact is, where do they live? Oh, way up there. Okay, well, all right, we'll call those birds. And then they fly. And then two is, can we eat them?
So there's a distinction, anything that flew was a bird, anything that they ate was livestock, and then the wild animals. So there's like three distinct.
Right, basically things that flew were birds, basically things that eat were livestock or domesticated animals or wild animals, like they would say coyotes and so forth. And then you have fish, of course, you eat them as well.
Every single thing, like a wolf or a coyote or a dog, they weren't individually named, it was just all.
She said they weren't individual named, just, well, we don't, okay, my view is we don't know, because it doesn't say. That's a good question, And do we say every single, and that's, again, back to those questions of the text, if we're pushing it as an ancient history lesson, it's extremely problematic. Because at the very beginning, for example, we know for a fact, based on archaeological record and fossil record, for a fact, that over 99% of all living beings that have ever existed on the planet are dead or they're extinct. Over 99%. Well, how many billions or trillions of life forms are there right now, from bacteria to fish to whatever? If you lined up every living being, unless you want to argue that, well, early on there were about 50, and then God made more later on. Okay, I mean, text doesn't say that. So if you assume at the beginning was everything he ever created ever, well, you've got probably trillions of animals. How long, if he did it every half a second, he'd still be counting the animals. So it becomes very problematic if you think every single animal that's ever existed ever, every insect, every whatever. I think an ancient person would go, they have no concept there's that many animals in the world. They have no concept of that.
So maybe they were all the same. Maybe
I think they pictured a lot smaller.
everything that flew is the same.
Well, not the same, but I'm going to wrap up. We got 12 seconds. That's all right. No, good. This is good. I just don't think the text answered those questions. I think their world is much smaller. The animal population was much smaller, so that seemed like a reasonable task. How they got in the ark. That's another, we'll talk about that. God bless you. We'll do Eve next.